most everyone knows because it's one of the most famous archaeological sites, at least in the prehistoric period, in southern India. Are we stuck? Okay, so normally at a talk we save all the acknowledgements for the end, but I decided that today I was going to do it the other way around and start with the acknowledgements at the beginning, because this is research that's done by a team. This is not just me, this is not just me and Mark. This is very much a collaboration between the Archaeological Survey of India and the University of Pennsylvania, and we're delighted to have quite a few members of our team with us today. So if you could all just raise your hands for a minute. Raise your hand, I know it's embarrassing. Yes, members of our team, thank you very much. So they are also really co-authors of this effort. And unfortunately, some of our colleagues from the ASI are unable to be here today, but I know that they're with us in spirit. Right? All right, so I'm going to just a quick outline of the talk. You'll see, I'm going to say, what is Bramhagiri? Where is it? For those of you who don't know. Why is it important? And this will be a big part of the talk itself. How are we restudying it? Because we, a key part of the project is reanalyzing both work that has happened before and starting out new work. And then just very briefly at the end, kind of a little tease for you, will be how might Bramhagiri be reimagined? So the title of the talk is Bramhagiri Reimagined, which is also the title of an article I published about it in 2005, kind of a long time ago now. But we're really just starting to think about reimagining Bramhagiri. Next slide. Okay, what is Bramhagiri? It's an archaeological site, you'll be shocked to hear. But like many archaeological sites in this part of Karnataka, not all of them, it's a large, very large, and very long occupied site. It's centered on and around the Bramhagiri Hill in Chitradurg district of Karnataka, and it covers quite a large area. So all the pictures I'm showing you are of the site. Next slide. This is a more or less, we think, unbroken, although that's an empirical question, we'll have to figure it out, 5,000-year-long occupational history, starting right from the Southern Neolithic, the beginnings of agriculture. That's the best evidence. This is a generalized chronological chart. These are not dates from Bramhagiri specifically. But based on what we have done and what other scholars have done, we have material, we think, from all of these time periods. The picture is actually a little bit of a trick. It's from another site, Karibakale, on the Tungabhadra River, and an excavation there showing just how deep some of these deposits are. Next slide. Okay, why is Bramhagiri important, right? And there are a number of different reasons. Next. I like to think of it as it's important because of both of its history and its history. And that is, it's a site that has had a significant amount of previous research. So it's history in this sense, right? Bramhagiri, as I'll talk about briefly, was very important in the history of archaeology, not just in South India, but in history of archaeology generally, but especially for those of us here who work in South India. Bramhagiri has long been seen as a very important kind of pivotal site that has defined a lot of the sequences and practices of our field. The work that was done at Bramhagiri, and I'll briefly mention some of the major projects, not everything, has really, in a way, contributed to the way in which archaeologists in India, particularly through government institutions, have set out research questions, right? The research questions that were asked in previous excavations have continued to animate research even till now. Some of the kind of field procedures that were established around this time are also field procedures that continue to be followed in Indian archaeology. Some of the ways that artifacts, especially pottery, are thought about, studied, and imagined, what people often think of the most important element of artifacts like pottery. All of this really stems from this long history of research, right? As in every part of the world. And then finally, the definition of time periods. Bramhagiri is sometimes referred to as the type site for South Indian archaeology. As we'll see, the kind of chronological delineation of Bramhagiri that was developed in the 1940s was really only for a segment of the site's history, not for the entire time that people lived at the site, but it was very, very influential in the naming of time periods and the naming of types and how we think about those time periods themselves, okay? But Bramhagiri is important not just because, you know, people worked there a long time ago, right? That's great and that's interesting and that still has ongoing legacies. But Bramhagiri itself is an important site, right? It's a site that's distinctive in some ways, like sites like Karibakale, like Maski, like sites around Sanganakalu. It has this very, very long occupational history, but it's different than some of those sites in ways that I think will be important, right? And by coming back to this well-known site with new methods and new questions many, many years later, I think that we have the possibility to understand not only the effects of the research history, but understand the significance of the history of Bramhagiri itself. Go to the next slide. Okay, so this is just a schematic timeline of research. I hope you in the back can see the small things, but we start really here in 1892 with epigraphic work that was done by Rice in the Mysore Archaeological Department, looking at things like the Ashokan Edict, and then all of the other kinds of inscriptional record that are associated with the Bramhagiri site. So Bramhagiri has not been, you know, it's been known for a long time. We didn't find it the way that we, for example, found Karibakale on our survey. There were a series of excavations I'll just briefly mention in the 30s and 40s by Mysore State, a very famous one in 1947, both by the ASI and by Mysore State. In the early 2000s, I did some work reanalyzing the Wheeler collections in the ASI archives in Delhi. In 2014, under the auspices of a project called Paleo Environments of Peninsular India, Mark and I and colleagues, including Karnataka State, did work on reservoir sediments. Oops. And Arjun Rao, in between 2016 and 2018, for his dissertation work, did survey work there. And this is not exhaustive. There are more, but these are the main ones. And now we've had 4 seasons on the SILT project, South Indian Landscape Trajectories. So we've actually now, I think, you know, spent much more time at the site now than just about any other previous project. So next. Okay, so just quickly, I'm not going to tell you every, you know, agonizing detail about the history of the site, but the very important early work was done by Mysore State Archaeology under the directorship of M.H. Krishna. And what's important about this is that Mysore State archaeologists and Krishna's team recognize Bramhagiri in a sense in its entirety, from the early time periods all the way through to the medieval parts of the site. And you can see here the 1934 Mysore State archaeological map, which is, you know, really quite good for its time. They mapped the city wall of the medieval side of the site, which was known as Hanea, the more famous side, or the sort of more prehistoric side over here. So Mysore State recognized all of the long parts of the site, and you can see lots of little numbers on the map. They documented a lot of features, which we have subsequently reanalyzed and relocated now with spatial precision on a geographic information system. Next. Of course, the excavation you're all waiting to hear about was the ASI excavation under the directorship of Mortimer Wheeler in 1947. Wheeler, as I'm sure you know, was the last British Director General of Archaeology, and 1947 was a very busy year in India. And the excavation at Bramhagiri took place for 1 season over the course of 3 months, March, April, and May, if you can imagine, while work went on at Chandravalli at the same time. So it was rather rushed, I should say, right? So it was 1 season and it was relatively quick. This is the map of Wheeler's that we've redrawn. This is the map maybe you've seen in the Ancient India publication about Bramhagiri. North is not to the top here, though. So if you look at a broader map, think of it similar to that Mysore State map. This little rectangle here is the same as this little rectangle there, okay? So what most of us growing up, learning about the archaeology of South India learned about was Bramhagiri was that little square and nothing else, right? But it turns out that there was, as we see, and as Mysore State had already figured out, a bit more to it than that. Okay, so 1 3-month season in that area. Of course, it was a long time ago, 1947, and they did not screen deposits or sieve deposits as we do now. So things like small bones and beads and all that kind of thing weren't necessarily collected. They were not interested so much in plant and animal remains as we are. So it was a very different kind of project, right? And particularly, as I'll say a little bit more about, one of the primary goals that Wheeler and his team had at Bramhagiri in 1947, working alongside Mysore State, I should say, was stratigraphic relationships and change through time. And of course, don't forget, 1947 was before the invention of radiocarbon dating. So they did not have what we have now, the possibility of getting dates independently of the artifacts. Next. Okay. One of the things Wheeler was most interested in, and we have not really done much of anything with at the moment, are the megaliths. Okay. Bramhagiri has an enormous field of megaliths. I mean, just really big. Wheeler mapped 3 areas. Here are reproductions of 2 of his 3 maps, A, B, and C. And on his map, he writes the areas between were cultivated areas with abundant remains of megaliths. So he didn't map every megalith. But so there is at the present no map of the entire field of megaliths, something that we're hoping, to remedy. Next slide. But there's been a massive amount of disturbance of the megaliths over the years. So here's a drone, some aerial drone imagery of an area of megaliths that's been highly disturbed. So this is not a main part of our research at the moment, but we're hoping that through remote sensing, we can get a more accurate map of the megaliths and integrate it with the work done in other parts of the site. Next slide. Okay, but megaliths were very, very important to Wheeler in 1947 because one of the things he really wanted to know when he came to Bramhagiri was what was the date of the South Indian megaliths, right? It was enigmatic, right? Here are some of his excavations, an area of megaliths now preserved by the ASI, and he wanted to date them, but without radiocarbon dates, he could only date them by association with artifacts, right? And the megaliths are not in obvious stratigraphic relationship to anything else. They're out by themselves in the field. So he used the deposits from what he called the Isila town site, is the eastern side of the outcrop, as a way of trying to date the megaliths by trying to match the pottery he found in the megaliths with the pottery he found in the town site, because they're separate. All right, and then one more time. So this is a list of the excavation units, don't worry about all the details, that were done in 1947 through the joint efforts of ASI and Mysore State. And you'll see that only 2 units and the little trench that connected them had what Wheeler thought was the whole 3-part sequence. Most of the other ones didn't. So because of that, next slide, he only published one of those sections, this very famous section from the trench PR21. It's one side of the trench, and it's not the whole side of the trench either. But this is where he illustrated his argument that he had found a succession of 3 cultures within what he called the Isila town site, from the Stone Axe to the megalithic to the Andhra culture. This is what we would now call Neolithic, Iron Age, and early historic. Okay, and I could go on about this, but I won't, I promise. But ask me later if you want to know that you have, except for the early Neolithic, which was quite distinctive, the Neolithic artifacts and the early historic artifacts in his mind they touch each other, and the megalithic artifacts or Iron Age do never occur on their own. This has always bothered me ever since I saw this profile, actually. Next. Okay, so we'll come back to this in a minute, but I just want to quickly say what are some long-term effects of this early work. One is the focus on stratigraphy, right? Every part of the world, there's a site where there's a pioneering use of stratigraphy, and that site is rightly famous. And Bramhagiri was one of those sites where we had a pioneering use of stratigraphy, very careful stratigraphy. And that is, good, let me say, right? But what we also see then is perhaps in part because of this, there's been a kind of enduring focus in South Indian archaeology and Indian archaeology in general on vertical excavation. All right, so that was important for understanding stratigraphy and change through time, was important for the goals of the project in 1947, but it has continued to be one of the questions that archaeologists ask the most, right? Ceramics are mostly seen as cultural markers or markers of time, that they're associated with being a particular people or peoples or of a diagnostic of a time period. So other kinds of ways of thinking about ceramics in terms of function, for example, or in terms of technology and trade have been just historically less important in our field, partly because of the legacy of this early work. And then finally, when you're interested in looking at change through time and periodization, there's a tendency to de-emphasize variation within a time period, right? So you have the Neolithic followed by the Iron Age. But what is the Neolithic all the same everywhere in every place? Of course not, right? But an excavation strategy that focuses on the kind of vertical tends to minimize those kinds of differences. And of course, then in the 1947 excavation, Wheeler came down here with a very particular reason, right? He wanted to create a pan-Indian chronology, right? So he was tracking artifacts. Remember, no radiocarbon dates, right? He was tracking artifacts with known time periods, especially imported ceramics that were found at sites like Arikamadu, and coins with undated pottery types. So for example, well, he was a little bit wrong about rouletted ware, but rouletted ware, Arantine ware, other sites that had a relatively short lifespan and were associated with local pottery, like the pottery we call russet coated painted ware. He felt that if you could apply those dates to the russet coated painted ware if you found it somewhere else. That was how things were done, and that was not an unusual strategy. However, in South India, we have this situation in which a lot of our ceramic types are really long-lived. People made these same kinds of ceramics for thousands and thousands of years. So that makes this kind of practice very difficult. Okay, next. All right, so that's enough about the history of research for now. Let's talk about the site itself, because it is an amazing site. And I will say I've been waiting my whole career to work at Bramhagiri. So Bramhagiri is important because, like so many other sites in this area, I'm interested in agriculture and farming. We have a 5,000-year-long history of farming in this really rather challenging semi-arid environment. Right? We have an opportunity now with new techniques and new approaches to look at issues of economic, social, and environmental change, something that previous research did not do because it wasn't part of what they were working on. Bramhagiri has unusually large and complex Neolithic deposits. This is a whole talk in itself, and I'm not going to give you a lot of details about this, but I am increasingly convinced that the Bramhagiri Neolithic is really different, it's really significant, and we have a lot more to figure out about that. It's also a place where we can study the history of urbanization and de-urbanization, right? Bramhagiri has an Ashokan edict, and the city of Isila is one of the early cities in South India. We don't know the exact dates yet, and we're really just barely working on this so far. But we have this very early urbanization that's not well studied in this part of South India. We also have, and you can see in the background, a very large, intact, early medieval and late medieval city of Hanea, which has not really been studied at all. And then last, but definitely not least, one of our goals is really to work training new generations in different archaeological methods, because it's been a great privilege for Mark and me to spend really all of our adult years working in South India. And we work with so many students and colleagues, and we want to be able to make the opportunity to use these new methods and ask these new questions for anyone who wants to. Next. Okay, I need to go a little faster. All right, yeah, so I mentioned, I think, and I already mentioned there's an Ashokan edict, 2, 3 right near Bramhagiri, 1 at Bramhagiri. And there's the southern cluster of Ashokan edicts. These are the 3 that are down here near Bramhagiri. So we're at the very, very southern end of the distribution of Ashokan edicts, which is something to think about. Next. And then the city of Hanea, which I also mentioned, we are busy doing drone mapping, documenting structures, and then also doing feature mapping. Here's the city wall, which I'll mention a few times. There's the map in progress of the city wall, trying to understand the spatial layout and spatial differentiation within the site. So not just the Neolithic or the Iron Age or the medieval, but differences in different neighborhoods and different parts of the site. Next slide. One thing that we have learned already is that the city of Hanea was quite large, larger than we ever expected. So this is the map I showed you before, where the sort of Wheeler box superimposed. And this is a map actually that I had my then student Peter Johansson make for me in around 2000, I think. And I just walked around, and so I estimated the size of Hanea like that, just from wandering around. Now I'm gonna say it's much closer to that big circle on the right. So we've already learned that the medieval occupation here was really significantly more expansive than we had imagined. Next slide. All right. Now we'll talk about our work finally. So how is Bramhagiri being restudied? We have an incredibly talented crew, many of whom are right here, and our Dr. Chad Hill, member of our team back in the corner here, is bringing us, kicking and screaming in my case anyway, into the 21st century with new digital technologies. And one of those is photogrammetry. So we're redocumenting all of the features and structures that Mysore State archaeology documented back in the 30s, as well as any other features that we have found, including things like hero stones. We have many, many hero stones. And so we're using photogrammetry. This is actually a 3D model of a hero stone. You can spin it around and study it. So really to preserve the record as well, because a lot of archaeological sites in India are actively under destruction. Bramhagiri is fortunate in that it's protected by the Archaeological Survey of India as a centrally protected monument, but not all sites are so lucky. Next. Okay, so one of our goals is to understand Bramhagiri in a broader context, the way that the Mysore State did back in the 30s, you might say. So this is a map that in our permit, that's our official research area, is 4,000 hectares. So it's more than a site in some ways. It's almost a small region. And so we want to understand the site within its local and regional context. We're particularly interested in reconstructing settlement and land use history from the beginnings of farming until the present, right? Because they've changed a lot. There's been urbanization, deurbanization, new crops, all kinds of things. And especially to reconstruct vegetation in the past, farming, food, and human environment. So very environmentally focused project in some ways, but also changes in social and cultural life that go along with urbanization and deurbanization. And then, of course, the trading component. Okay, so we have 3 phases to our work, and we spent 2 seasons already working on phase 1. It's not 100% finished, but phase 1 is establishing spatial control, documenting surface material, including artifacts, and integrating previous research in, right? Because one thing that we saw when we started is there is no single map other than that Mysore State map from the 30s that has all of the site. There's no accurate map. There's no map that locates previous excavation units. So we're spending a lot of time getting one unified mapping system in GIS spatial control so that all work can be put into the same system and we can compare in that way. We developed, we spent the first season doing a large scale drone-based orthophoto, which I perversely giving you a picture of a paper map on my desk. But it looks a little bit like you're just looking at Google Earth, but it is not actually Google Earth. It is very, very fine detail to the, Chad, 5 centimeters, 4 centimeters, 4 centimeter resolution, right? So you can really zoom in on it. So this is an incredible resource, and it's the basis for our mapping system. We also did some LiDAR mapping, drone-based LiDAR. We studied the surface artifact distributions, doing systematic transects to try and understand how different parts of the site were occupied at different times. All this before we put any holes in the ground. We've been doing remote sensing of the subsurface. I'll show you some pictures in a minute. Doing some section scraping, re-scraping some of the old section, including 2 of Wheeler's section, to re-understand them. And then finally, starting in January 2025, new excavations. Okay, so just some pretty pictures. This is Hanea up on top of the hill. The city of Hanea continues not just down on the fields below, but it's also on top of the outcrop with some very elaborate architecture, palaces, temples, walls, roads, really quite amazing. So we've been documenting that. Next slide. Also still in Hanea, then on the one hand, you can see this temple and this temple are the same. There's a little kind of sister temple there has been taken apart. It's from the drone image. So early medieval temple in Hanea, Shiva temple, next. And then the remote sensing, which again is a whole nother talk, but this is my one and only slide for it. We're using both electrical resistivity, which doesn't photograph very well. Here are people in the field doing electrical resistivity basically to map subsurface deposits, and something called ERT, where we have a fancy new machine that also studies subsurface of deposits, but instead of horizontally, more like vertically in slices. So we're spending a lot of money and time trying to understand the site in its large scale without doing excavation for everything, because that's just impossible. It's so big. Next. Oh, sorry, one thing. Can you go back? So, oh no, I'm sorry. It's not that important. That's okay, just go to 27. Okay, so as well as doing section work on old excavation profiles, there's also a lot of natural holes and ditches, farmers' ditches and things. And so yeah, so you can see here some of the results of the resistivity. You see these squares, square kind of line. Here's the Jain temple and a big building. So we use this to sort of help direct our excavation strategy. So in phase 2, we're doing targeted test excavations, but we try to do first the resistivity mapping so that we have a general sense of what's under the ground before we start putting holes in the ground. Okay, next. Besides scraping back the sections of 2 of Wheeler's units, we also, in collaboration with ASI, scraped back a section of a very, very large ash mound. Here we call it Neolithic ash mound, called Ash Mound 1. That's Ramesh from the ASI. And here you can see the photogrammetry of the section as well. So it's a very complex history of ash mound construction, use, reuse. And so we're quite interested in ash mounds, which, as you'll see, it turns out to be something we have to be interested in. And in understanding their long histories, right? Not just as finished monuments, but as sort of how they're used and constructed and changed through time. Next slide. Okay, so that's phase 1, surface, mapping, spatial control, etc. Phase 2, which we've started now, is test excavation. So very small units, 2 by 2 meter units, in diverse areas of the site, and especially unstudied areas. So given that there has been previous research, we focus on areas where there hasn't been previous research, and interested in spatial differentiation within broadly defined time periods. So for example, in the medieval city of Hanea, we have 5 units? 4 units, 4 test units, but all in different, what seem to be neighborhoods, right? Based on our understanding and mapping of the surface, right? And similarly for other time periods, we're trying to get some variation. We're especially interested in recovering plant and animal remains and environmental samples, something that has not been possible in the past. So it's a big focus of our project. And of course, in getting a lot of good radiometric gates. So to understand the chronology and pacing and tempo. Next. Okay, so paleoenvironmental analysis is something that's less common, I think, in Indian archaeology than study of artifacts and structures. This is actually me down in a hole in our excavations in 2014 at Bramhagiri, collecting reservoir, that's an old reservoir, collecting sediment samples to study the changes in vegetation and environment through time. And so some of the kinds of things that we do are study of plant remains, of sediment, and also, of course, of dating in order to answer some of the questions that we have. Next slide. And this, I mean, maybe I should have made the words a little bigger, I apologize. But just to give you a sense of what answers these methods give us, right? So we're studying pollen and phytoliths. Phytoliths are small silica bodies that are formed in plants. They're very tough and they preserve for a really long period of time. So different plant parts, basically small plant parts. They can tell us about the changes in the vegetation. We're doing geochemical sediment analysis through the work of Mariah McKenna, a PhD student, to study things like erosional regimes, macroscopic and microscopic charcoal, animal bones, stable isotope, plant macrofossil. So all of these different methods, it does take a lot of expertise and a lot of labor, but they can tell us different things about these kinds of questions, and the different lines of evidence hopefully will come together in order to form a fuller picture. Oh, and those are pictures of pollen grains. Courtesy Kew Gardens, that's not my photo. It's pretty great though. Thanks. Okay, so again, this is an image from our current permit, ASI permit. And as I said, we're doing, we asked for 9 test excavation units, and we're near to completing that now, fingers crossed, within the next month or so. And you can see that our test units are scattered all around the site, right? Both the prehistoric deposits, historic deposits, and other that have both, to try and get a kind of broad spatial understanding. So all of phase 1, the surface work, and all of phase 2, the test units, is really about generating these kind of broad understandings. Next slide. All right. It's very boring for everyone who's not a part of the project to have to look at a lot of pictures of excavation units. I'm not going to do that, but I'm just going to, and also we're still working, so I'm not really ready to tell you, but I was going to give you a little flavor of the units that we're doing. So one unit, BRH109, say Wheeler referred to Bramhagiri as BR. And for me, that's a little hard to forget. But now a 3-letter nomenclature is used. So with the request of the ASI, we have changed it to BRH. That's now Bramhagiri. So 109, this is an area we worked last January and February very closely with ASI. This was actually an amazing area where we had surface after surface, so floor after floor after floor with wattle and daub structures, as shown by post holes. So we put these little pin flags in the post holes while we're mapping. So you can see kind of a rectangular structure in this 4.5 by 4.5 meter excavation unit. And we just had floor after floor after floor. And I think some of these are Iron Age. We don't have the dates back yet. But so it's an area of occupation on the east side of the structure. And this is not a kind of strategy of excavation that had been done before. So Wheeler had worked in that area, but he was not so interested in defining surfaces and floors and what people are doing on them. So it's a little bit of a different approach. Next slide. 3 units, 106, 7, and 8, are on the eastern side of the outcrop in an area we call the occupied terraces, right? You can see this in medieval inscription right at the beginning. But so the occupied terraces, they look kind of like this. They have a lot of little rubble walled structures. It's a huge part of the outcrop, clearly, that was very densely occupied. It's not easy to work in right now because it's covered with thorny bushes. But we seem to have occupation from multiple time periods in this area. So we're working on trying to understand that. And this is really important, I think, because this is a big part. There's definitely medieval, but there's also a lot of prehistoric material here. And this was never excavated. All of Wheeler's units and the Mysore State units were down on the level area at the base of the hill. We're working on the side of the hill where people were definitely living in large numbers. Next. Yeah, so these areas, you know, as I said, have never been excavated before. This is one unit. We call it Mutu's unit fondly, with Mariah taking a picture where we are digging literally through ash mound deposits in this case. Okay, next slide. Sorry, I didn't have a better picture, humbly. We just opened a new excavation unit 2 or 3 days ago, I think. in an area also that really has not been studied ever. It's an area that has a very, very dense distribution of what seem to be early historic ceramics on the surface. And this is not from that area, but it's a Shatavahana pendant that we found in a section cleaning in the 2023 season. So we think that if anything has sort of the possibility of being downtown Asila, let's say the early historic city, then it's probably in this area. So we're excited to learn more about that. Next slide. We have two excavation units, two, inside the city wall of Hanea. This one on the right is in progress right now. And then this is an orthophoto, photogrammetry of one that we excavated last season. So this is a kind of, fancier neighborhood, you might say, within the early medieval city of Hanea. Next. And then this is the area, both of these units are relatively close to the beautiful little Jain temple that we have here. And these are some of the artifacts that came from two of the units in that area last season. Some steatite, some proper pencils and some kind of ugly steatite shape, cowrie shells, a little sort of terracotta plaque image, and other things. So, I mean, this is purely my speculation, and I think Mark might be rolling his eyes, that there may be like a Jain neighborhood near the Jain temple. But in any case, this is a kind of early medieval assemblage. It's quite interesting. And then outside the city wall, who's living out there, right? These are not the, it's not the high rent district, right? So we have two excavation units outside the city wall here, and we are wondering, are there social differences? Are they occupied at the same time that you have people living up on top of the outcrop in palaces and with fancy temples, down on the base of the outcrop inside the city wall, protected with fancy artifacts, or are they could possibly chronologically different, or both? So these are fresh from the field photos. Next. And then, of course, like all archaeological work, there's a lot of lab work involved. So we've been doing a lot of that because we screen or sieve all of our deposits. We have a tremendous number of artifacts, including little pieces of pottery, and we're doing analysis of the ceramics. And then you can also see Garima here, our float master on the right, flotation samples to get plant remains out. So we're really working hard to try and recover all of those kinds of specialized materials, the plant remains, the animal bones, samples for chemical analysis, the whole thing. Okay, next slide. All right, then just briefly, I know we're all getting a little tired. I'll ask, how is Bramhagiri being reconsidered, right? So we called it Bramhagiri Reconsidered, and this again could be a whole nother talk. But there are many ways in which we're already beginning to rethink them. And I'm sure by this time next year, we'll have some more information. One way, of course, is chronology, right? So this is a sample from the lab of radiocarbon samples being packaged up to send off for dating. And what you may not know, but I think is very exciting, is that some are ones that we got from, in this case, section scraping of Wheeler sections, but some are actually samples that were collected by the ASI in 1947. And I got those in the early 2000s. ASI kindly gave me permission to take them out for dating. And so these little tags are the 1947 tags. So we have both the dates from the original excavation and new dates from our scraping of those exact same sections, which makes me feel a little better, I will say, about the dates, because we'll see if they correlate. Next slide. One way in which Bramhagiri has been reconsidered already is, I told you it was an enormous Neolithic site, and I think that we're going to have a lot of Neolithic habitation area, but there are also so many ash mounds, and big ash mounds. A lot of them are buried or partially buried, as you can see here, and depending on how you count them, and this is an important question because some of them may overlap or touch, there are at least 9 ash mounds at Bramhagiri, probably 10. So we're using ERT to map them. this season, because it's, although we are excavating some of them, and these are exposed, as you can see, in ditches and natural openings, it's not possible to understand everything from the subsurface. Should I stop or pause? Yeah, okay. And one thing I didn't say is that in the literature, if you're not familiar with the Neolithic of South India, the kind of consensus, except for a few brief mentions of people who is the original, because I didn't move any of the accumulated soil out, I only scraped off what was exposed. But you can see where I use this gray color, this, and this are all ash mound layers. So those are all ash mound material. And that corresponds in depths with this, this, and this. So it looks like the 1947 excavations went through layers of ash mound, but didn't recognize them as being ash mound because they were quite different in that way. Next slide. Okay, and then back to that famous BR21 section. Okay, so remember Neolithic, early Neolithic, later Neolithic, I'll call it Iron Age, and early historic. So this levels 1 through 6 were seen as Andhra culture. But radiocarbon dates, the asterisk means that those are dates from Wheeler's own excavations. And the one on top is a new one I got from the scraping. Put them at the 11th and 12th century AD, which explains why there was a lot of medieval pottery in those drawers, because there were medieval deposits right there. So the levels that were thought to be Andhra or early historic certainly are not, right? We have a lot more, and this is what I suggested as far back as 2005. We have a lot more radiocarbon dates to run, so there's really, much to be looked. So this is mostly published, except this is a new date, not in that 2005. And that's from the neighbor trench, BR22, but they're correlated quite closely. Okay, so already then how we're rethinking Bramhagiri in many ways is rethinking it chronologically. And that's not just, oh, it's a different time period than we thought, but that also has implications for things like what artifacts are found in those layers. How do we think about that? If, for example, we can't just look at a piece of russet-coated painted ware and say, oh, it's early historic, as Ambali and I have worked on. This is like the foundation for a lot of South Indian archaeology. We think that we can look at black and red ware, RCPW, and we can diagnose the time period. But it turns out clearly that it's more complicated than we thought. So that's partly why this is important. And then also, again, these blue arrows, this is the same like what you saw in the BR17 section. I re-scraped and reanalyzed the same BR21 section in 2023. And the layers here labeled as chunam and mixed chunam by Wheeler are actually ash mound layers. So Wheeler went through ash mound layers in almost every unit. Next slide. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's only a section, right? So, and that's why we're now actually excavating in those kinds of units. So, but yes, some are, more fill, but some do seem to be habitation. So there's clearly a tempo of ash mound building and, rebuilding and interim activities. And so we're working now, especially in those units on the terraced hillside, to just peel that apart layer by layer and try to understand those kind of like life histories of those. All right, so this is, I think, my last slide. Zach asked, what's next? So I mentioned phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 3, which is a little ways down the road, will be larger scale excavations. At the same time, we'll continue our work doing remote sensing, mapping, lab analysis. That work never ends, unfortunately. And then maybe most exciting, in a way, are the whole raft of student and young professional PhDs and specialized research projects. There's a few more that might happen, but these are ones which I'm pretty sure the student has, agreed. So if your name is there and you didn't know you agreed, you better talk to me soon. But some of the kinds of work that's being done, geoarchaeological work, specialized analyses on rustic coated painted ware, landscape analysis, fire history, vegetation, faunal analysis, microliths, ceramic residue analysis, and charcoal analysis, just to name a few. So, I mean, I think this is a really exciting component of the project as well, is the opportunities for students and others for short-term, engagement, but even more so for specialized training and kind of long-term work. Excellent. That's it. I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Dear students, it's a very inspiring talk, and much more than what I could have learned from textbooks or classroom lectures. So I wish the questions come from students here. What about, you have a question?
I'm not a student at so I'm not a very good student of archaeology because I've not studied much. But I'm just curious, like, what is the difference between the plants that were in those days, like the prehistoric period in this area, and how are they different from the plants and the vegetation that we see today?
That's a great question, and you don't become a bad student just because you're starting, right? So plants. One of the things in terms of plants, like the plants that people are growing, is that like other sites in South India, in the Neolithic period, people are growing a range of millets and pulses. Right? When we look at the landscape of South India, sometime in the early historic or early medieval, like centuries AD, CE, people start to grow and eat a lot of rice. Right? Rice is not indigenous to South India, but it's hard to imagine South India without rice. Right? I mean, imagine South Indian food without rice. Shocking. Okay. So that's one of the questions that we're interested in. For example, are we going to see, especially in these elite areas where they have the more wealthy people, are they going to have rice, whereas other people are eating millets and pulses? We know that this is the case at Vijayanagar, for example. Right? So that's one kind of question. The other kind of question has to do with things like the regional vegetation. So when people live in a place for a long time, they often cut down or remove a lot of the trees and other woody vegetation. That has an effect on the environment, has effect on things like erosion. And so by looking at microscopic charcoal and then also identifying macroscopic wood charcoal, we hope to be able to understand that. And then also the pollen analysis from water bodies will also tell us about vegetation through time. We have not done those studies yet, so I can't actually tell you any of the answers. We do know in the area around Hampi, Vijayanagar, that when the city of Vijayanagar was big in the early 16th century, they had really, basically cut down almost every tree in the region. But after the abandonment of the city, the trees came back, right? So there's lots of questions like that. And then in the Southern Neolithic, there was a difference in the climate also, right? So there was a drier period. So will we see that in, for example, the types of acacias that we find on the site? So these are all big questions, and just because we're just starting our work, I can't actually answer them. I'll tell you one more thing real quickly, and that, again, we're just starting the animal bone analysis, but from the site of Kadivatale up north on the Tungabhadra, we found big changes in what animals there were through time. So in the Iron Age, like around 1000 BCE, there were all kinds of wild animals. I mean, people were hunting and eating wild animals, but there were animals that are not common in this part of India anymore, right? Because their habitat has been displaced. And that changed through time. So I'm hoping that we can also see some of that kind of thing as well.
Okay, I may have. What about this Rappa culture?
So you can see, I mean, in my little chronological chart at the bottom, I mentioned Seshadri, 1956. So what's come to be called the Ropa culture is microliths that are found in and around the village of Ropa. We have microliths in Neolithic deposits, no question, right? So the existence of microliths in and of themselves is not necessarily chronologically significant. Seshadri didn't do any excavation, it was all surface material, and there's a lot of Neolithic occupation around Ropa. So I just don't know the answer to that. It could be that that's just, he found microliths that were part of the Neolithic history of that area, or it could be that there's some earlier material. And that would be really interesting if there were earlier material. So far, none of the excavations have showed anything earlier than Neolithic. And the 1947 trenches had that very distinctively different early Neolithic, right? With different pottery and so on, but there was no indication of a pre-Neolithic habitation. But of course, as you know, and you're the expert on this, that there must have been around. We just don't have definitive evidence. So the jury's out on that one.
Yeah, because since the time of the Subara, who was also trained in Bramhagiri,
Yeah.
he tried to find similar things at Sanganikal.
Yes.
So they defined some pre-Neolithic, and then when Santle excavated in the Bangladesh, we found some microlithic.
Right, yes.
So when we did this kind of field walking and mapping every feature on the map, we found that microliths were certainly it could be integrated with the Neolithic activity, because that was the only source, was the only source for microliths in that area. And then there could be kind of with the Neolithic activity. But that offset the river from offset to which we also excavated, we have not found the material including microliths. And the source of raw material is right there.
Right.
So we got a date which really pushes back in time to early to see or something. So that is why I was wondering if the Papa was identified by Neil himself. And then I think it was the similar type section, type sequence was to be repeated, like you said.
Yeah.
Most of the archaeologists post 1947 tried to do vertical excavation,
Right.
do culture history,
Yeah.
reconstruction. So
Yeah.
it became a root paradigm for all of them. But then we started thinking differently when we started working on Sanganikal. And then everyone said 4,200 years ago was a major time phase all over the world.
Right.
There it is
Right.
Meghalaya and everything. And what was enigmatic for us was why these sites are associated with rivers. And there's not the area where you have a very source of water.
Mhm.
And in the landscape that we are familiar with, we don't have organized drainage network at all. And then when we started mapping, close mapping of all the cultural features, we began to see tufa in the crevices and fissures and so on, all along the sides of the hill and so on. So we got a feeling that when we looked at the landscape from the top of the hill, there were these black soil patches all along the hills.
Mhm.
So they were the concrete environments
Right.
5,000 years ago.
Right.
So I thought it's not the river network which mattered the uncovered settlements in a location
Yeah.
to be seen, but the spring activity. So I was wondering, it's such a great complex of hills. Are you in a position to identify fossil springs?
Yeah, I mean, I think one important thing to understand about these granitic hills that you see around here is that they are the most important source of runoff water. So right now, during the monsoon, actually, Bramhagiri Hill is still leaking water days and days after the big heavy rainfall. So there's sort of cracks in the granite and there are springs, it seeps out. So that's, people have been harvesting rainwater around the base of the outcrop, on outcrops, through rock pools and other kinds of things. So if you think of these granitic hills as like giant water sponges in some ways, that's the most important thing that people were using. So, I mean, as you also know, at Teklakota, Nagaraja Rao found a few microliths underneath, Neolithic levels. But you can point to example after example, but none of them have, unlike the sites you're talking about, have radiometric dates or fauna. And so you think, well, maybe, right? So I think that, the possibility is certainly there, and it will be exciting to see if it does. But at present, we just don't have any evidence for that. Other questions?
Any more questions?
To know one thing about the Ropa culture already, Professor said that Ropa culture was declined when was the decline of Ropa culture?
Defined?
Decline.
Oh, decline. Okay.
Or continues till today. What is your exact opinion on based on your studies?
So as I understand it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but what is called the Ropa culture is an assemblage of microliths that are found on the surface around the village of Ropa, which is on the east side of the Bramhagiri outcrop. They were seen as being Mesolithic or broadly Mesolithic, right, in date, but there's no radiometric dates and there's no excavation, there's no associated animal bones or anything like that. So they're definitely microliths, there's no question about that. So if Seshadri, well, this was his PhD work in '56, if he's right that it's a kind of Mesolithic assemblage, then so far it seems like it stands alone, right? That it's not found in stratigraphic relationship to later deposits. So underneath the Neolithic deposits that have been excavated previously, and we haven't gotten that deep yet, so this is not us, there was just natural soil. There was no kind of Ropa culture, right? So what is the Ropa culture? The Ropa culture is some microliths. I wouldn't call it a culture. I would say that there's some nice microliths. When do they date to? Do they date to the micro? I don't know. Nobody knows actually.
Generally thought to be Mesolithic.
Right, but microliths can be found in other time periods too. So during the Neolithic, yeah, there are microliths in the Neolithic, for example, and even some in the Iron Age that we found at Karibakwe. So right now, we have a student of microliths right here, Mutu, is excavating in an area inside a Neolithic ash mound, and we have microliths in it. So microlith does not equal Mesolithic. So the Ropa, so-called Ropa culture, I don't know, what it is specifically because we just don't have enough information about it. But the question we were just asking is there occupation of Bramhagiri before the Neolithic? And the answer is, I don't know. Yeah. No, Andhra is what we call early historic, so much later. Yeah, right.
Thank you.
In fact, microliths go back to 50 to 60,000 years now. So there are microliths in Africa, microliths in the Mesolithic, Neolithic, and sometimes Neolithic structure. So there is a distinctive potential.
You know what? It's a little bit like the pottery problem, right? That you have certain types of pottery, let's say black and red ware, which are some beautiful examples in this museum. Black and red ware was made during part of the Neolithic. It was made through the Iron Age. It was made through the early historic. And maybe, based on what we're finding right now, it was made even into the beginnings of the medieval period. So if you have a piece of black and red ware and you pick it up off the surface, you can't really say for sure how old it is. So people were very attached to their ways of making pottery, to their ways of making stone tools. And that makes it hard for archaeologists. They were not thinking about us, obviously. But that means that a lot of the kind of taken for granted assumptions that we have about all of these types, we need to rethink a bit.
Thank you. Any more? Okay. Thank you so much. And Manali is part of our team looking after the activities of this museum. I requested to focus on the facts. Take this.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, sir. So on behalf of the Robert Bruce Wood Sandankalli Archaeological Museum, I thank Dr. Kathy Morrison for the very engaging lecture that we had today and for giving us so many insights into the history and the history of Sandankalli. Thank you so much. And sorry, Bramhagiri, I'm very sorry. I also thank everybody present here, Dr. Mark, all the PhD students, everyone who has joined from various universities. Thank you all for joining us today and for making this a successful event. And I also thank Dr. Gauri Shettar sir for being with us and for giving us this opportunity to join with such wonderful resource persons. Thank you very much. Thank you all.